again, I want to say that it has been and it continues to be a very weird and challenging year. And there's been three things that have kept me going. One has been the natural environment around me. The other has been my knitting. And the third has been the fellowship of all the people involved in community economies thinking and practice. So I thank you for that. I'm speaking to you from, now I want to move my slides on. So why is that not happening? There you go. I'm speaking to you from my home on the banks of the Georges River in Sydney. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land. You can see the little star where I am, and I'm living at the boundaries of the Gadigal, Darug and Dharawal nations. This land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I join with them to care for country. So this practice of acknowledging the traditional owners of country at the start of any public meeting has become a commonplace ritual in Australian academic circles, at least over only really the last decade. And for me, it's a very important ethical practice with performative effects. But today, as we've seen with the huge awakening all over the world of what has to happen if Black lives are really to matter, I don't think I can leave my acknowledgement of country just at that. I need to also acknowledge the privilege that I enjoy that has been based upon the dispossession and exploitation of Indigenous Australians and Pacific Islanders in this country over the past 200 years. On one side of my family, I'm a fourth generation Australian, descended from a poor English butcher's apprentice who was convicted for stealing and transported to Australia as a convict. He worked in servitude for a wealthy doctor at Regentville over near Penrith in the western part of Sydney on stolen Aboriginal land. And when he was freed, he set up as a butcher in Penrith, and his son became a wholesale grain merchant, a merchant capitalist, and his son, my grandfather, a cleric. So within one short generation, this family, the Dent family, moved from poverty to the middle class off the backs of this kind of violent uncommoning. On the other side of my family, I'm a third generation Australian, descended from a free Scottish settler who with his father and brothers established a sugar plantation on stolen Aboriginal land in Queensland, which is Australia's kind of deep south. And the Gibsons employed and enslaved Pacific Island labourers to farm that plantation. My grandfather, who was the son of this Scottish slave owner, moved to Sydney to become a doctor and again bought stolen land at Gunnamatta Bay in the south of Sydney, where I spent much of my childhood playing in what was known as Darook Park. And I was oblivious as growing up to the fact that this was named after the surviving members of the Darug people. So thinking in common with community economies, and particularly with the commons yardstick, or what we might really call also the uncommons yardstick, has helped to focus my thinking about decolonisation and reparative research. A violent uncommoning of others' countries and livelihoods has contributed to my family's fortunes over the 3 or 4 generations. This stark realisation isn't a pleasant one. It brings to the fore the connectivity between my lived world and the destruction of others' livelihoods. But I think that acknowledging this connectivity is important. So in her book, Shimmer, written in the last days of her life, my dear friend, anthropologist and philosopher, Deborah Bird-Rose, writes about living ethically with each other and with other species. And she's taught me that to respond to and affirm connectivity is to make ethics possible. Connectivity, or we might say interdependence, calls forth ethical action. The focus of Deb's book is the flying fox communities in Australia that do so much to create a lively world of pollen propagation, fruitfulness and joy, but who are terribly persecuted by forest clearing, horticulturalists, and increasingly urban dwellers who are upset with the increased size of flying fox colonies in cities where they've been driven as environmental refugees. So Deb's work and others in the field of environmental humanities thinks alongside community economies and has been inspirational in helping me develop thoughts about ethics and the more than human. As she writes in her book, we're beneficiaries of flows that so vastly precede us and so widely connect us to other creatures and to the biosphere that our indebtedness is impossible to imagine. We creatures who are alive today, human beings and psyllids, flying foxes and eucalypts, all of us are pulses of life becoming with others in webs of complexity, diversity, and abundance. So you can note in this quote, I think, some of the resonances with our work on intergenerational connections, on diversity, on becoming with others. And I see particularly connections between this kind of statement and the work that Ethan did in his book, Reimagining Livelihoods. So community economies thinking is built on an ontology of being in common. And the connectivity implied in the idea of being in common, though, is not always easy or beneficial. And I think that our commitment to ethical action expresses a willingness to participate in these very flows of energy and power and materiality and spirit that Deb writes about that make connection. As I see it, we're not just talking about, though, jumping into that flow, but increasing the potential for mutual life-giving. That is, for these flows to create mutual benefit and care. This means then taking up positions, trying out potentials, making strategic decisions on an undecidable, as in uncertain and always shifting terrain. And this, I think, is the definition of politics that Julie and I settled on when we were writing a post-capitalist politics. And I think it still stands as my conception of what the political is. So in this talk, I want to try out this kind of work of jumping into the flow, making connections. And I want to delve into some of the work that community economy scholars are doing that is just this, jumping into the flow, making connections, thinking with and alongside others, multiplying and forging pathways for ethical action, expanding what a post-capitalist politics is. And of course, I can't attempt a comprehensive survey of all the work that we're doing. There's so much wonderful work going on, as we saw in the publication of the Handbook of Diverse Economies, which is a testament to this work. And here I'd like to thank and acknowledge Kelly Dombrowski as my co-editor in this book, and all the 69 authors who are members of CERN who contributed to this volume. And this is just a shout out for all of you who haven't sent me a photograph. You have to do that so that you can be added to this particular picture. And I think it's just an amazing thing that actually 25% of our CERN membership have a chapter in this book. So I can't be comprehensive, but what I'm going to do is just explore two particular threads of thinking. One is a thread concerned with measurement and policy, and I think reflects our growing confidence as community economy scholars. And the other is a thread of connection with the deep, long-standing and embodied non-Western traditions of thinking about ethical economies and lifeways, and I hope reflects our humility and willingness to learn. So first, the importance of inventory and measurement to projects of governing is something that we've all been schooled in by reading Michel Foucault, James Scott, Timothy Mitchell, James Ferguson, Tanya Lee, and many others. And of course, the successful attempts by feminists like Marilyn Waring to shift the focus on what gets counted by governments when it comes particularly to labouring has been a major inspiration to community economies theorising, especially when we've been theorising how politics of language feeds into social transformation. And here, by a politics of language, I'm meaning the work of naming, making things visible and categorising. So recently we've seen certain researchers expanding our capacities to measure aspects of community economies. That is, we've seen a move on from the work of inventory, which is still so important in making diverse economy practices visible, to actual measurements of that contested concept impact. So I just want to mention a few examples. And one is measuring food garden production. And this year I had the pleasure of reading CERN member Lucy Svavova's PhD thesis, which is entitled Grow, Share or Buy, Understanding Diverse Economies of Urban Gardens. Lucy's study documents how much food is produced and consumed directly in urban food gardens, in backyards and allotments, in a sample of households in the city of Brno in the Czech Republic. And using the data that she collected over 4 months, combined with conservative estimations and extrapolations, she found that the respondent households produced on average about 219 kilos of food in their gardens, or 97 kilos per person. She found that, that there was self-sufficiency in fruits, vegetables and potatoes that ranged on average from 13% in winter to 56% in summer. And this was the kind of thing that people did with this food, produced or stored it, gave it away or consumed it. So to just put this study in the national context, she states that 38% of the Czech population engages in this kind of activity. And as Lucy said, this is ordinary, widespread, and non-spectacular. So just on quantity alone, you can see how this kind of food production reduces the ecological footprint of this particular city and modern living. But in addition, of course, food provisioning for household gardens creates multiple values. It creates not just calories and food bill savings, but health, activity, connection with nature, and fun. The findings of this research have important practical implications for urban planning and policy. Measuring the amount of food that can be produced in a diverse economy, as Lucy has done, has the potential to shift the discourse about economic impact. If we take, for example, Detroit, where there's a long history of urban food gardening, especially in African American communities going back to the late 19th century, we can see that there's been in recent times a proliferation of urban gardening projects. And this map doesn't map, of course, just backyard gardening. This is an image, and there's a strong interest in Detroit of developing this local food system, and particularly because the majority population of people of colour experience food insecurity. So this image from the Detroit Food Policy Council of Detroit, an organisation that actually grew out of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, shows the food system as they see it. But from a diverse economy perspective, we'd like to see the food system include production that was commodified as well as non-commodified. But when the economic impact of Detroit's food system was calculated in 2014, when I and others were looking into doing some partnering research in this area, we saw that only commodified food production and formal employment was counted in this estimation of impact. So my point is that by ignoring the quantity, the quality, and the value of urban garden food production in Detroit, a large part of the functioning economy is left out of the picture. And this is particularly important as property foreclosure, speculation, and gentrification are threats contributing to the further dispossession and displacement of Black communities in that city. In negotiations over urban development, only financial return on assets, that is capitalist financial value, features as a determining calculus. And so I'd like to ask, what if we were able to bring to the table other calculuses that would acknowledge the kind of data that Lucy's developed and collected, and that acknowledges all the values that community economies generate? So this is actually what a group of us have tried to do for our urban project in an outer suburban part of Paris. And here I'm going to be referring to a paper that we published in Environmental Policy and Governance, and thank you to other CERN members who were the editors of this special edition. So it was written with Doina and Konstantin, who are the architect practitioners who initiated the urban project, and Maliha Safri, an economist who's a member of CERN, and myself. So in this project, via a process of engagement with the local community and the local municipality, two packets of land were commandeered or commoned in this region of Colombes. The original conception was to develop interconnected hubs for growing food at the agro-city, producing social housing at the eco-hab, and recycling material waste at the recyclab, and in general, in connection, conducting ecological education, cultural exchange, and commons building and negotiation. And the original plan was to do this over a period of 10 to 15 years. Only the agro-city and the recyclab actually eventuated. And after 4 years of operation, political change in the municipality saw the forceful closure of these projects so that the agro-city in particular could be used as a car park. In the business as usual language, the argument was that the asset value of the land could now be realised. But before the closure, a whole lot of things were measured and estimated, producing a rich database from which to calculate our community economy return on investment. And this was something that Jenny and Stephen and I kind of thought about and presented in Take Back the Economy. So against the initial investment that came from public funds of 1.2 million euros, we used the data collected at Rurban and also realistic estimations and evidence-based indicators to see what this investment unleashed in terms of community economy returns, as we can see here on the left-hand side of this picture. So using the data that was collected just for 1 year, we calculated what the direct financial revenues generated by Rurban were. We estimated the value of the unpaid volunteer labour that was expended, which was huge. We estimated the value of increased individual capacity that then was generated through interaction with Rurban, and the costs that were saved by Rurban to households, to the collective itself, and to the state. And the value of all these returns amounted to some 3.4 million euros. Just as Lucy showed, though, with her urban gardeners in Brunel, multiple forms of value were also created at Rurban, many more that couldn't be translated into monetary amounts, such as, for example, the value of learning to become a commoner. But even staying with monetary amounts, we showed that the contribution of benefits derived from unpaid, shared and care activities was huge, some 10 times more than the visible direct financial returns, which came from selling things and so on, which amounted to only 300,000 euros. This commoning value, though, is usually invisible, and our exercise in quantification, admittedly drawing on the master's tools, attempted to put commodified and non-commodified value into the same calculating frame. When we calculated the return, then we saw that it was something like 180% on that initial investment. And remember, this was just for 1 year. Had the project lasted the full 10 years, the return would have been much greater. And I just want to say that this Rurban experiment has now been replaced and moved and is actually flourishing in a number of different locations across Paris. But to use the language of Michel Bowens, we showed that value can be co-opted from the old system, from capitalism to some extent, and invested in commons that are capable of creating new commoning value. And this kind of exercise is important when we're making demands on the state for release of unused land, or reuse of abandoned built infrastructure, or resistance to property speculation, or the concreting over of wonderful productive land as a car park. So this brings me to the issue of policy and what openings there may be for community economy thinking and calculating. One of the questions that community economy scholars invariably get is, where is the state in your understanding or your politics? And I've always seen the state as itself many things. I've always found the abstraction of the state a hard one to take seriously. But I do take the point that community economies work rarely engages with policy directly. And this might be an area of connectivity to develop. And so for this reason, I was really thrilled to see the publication of Enacting Community Economies Within a Welfare State that was edited by Teppo Eskelinen with his colleagues Tuuli and Juhana. This book explores the connectivity between community economies thinking and what he calls the ethos of the welfare state. In chapter 2, Teppo makes a stab at identifying what the community economy value conception is. And here he lists some of the characteristics, so I list them. The community economy value conception values all inputs into the economy. It recognises the empowerment of valuing all skills or all contributions. It acknowledges and values the social interactions of ethical interaction through co-production and co-consumption. It's based on a notion of participation and trust building to enable shared negotiation and processes of value creation. And it resists ideas of fixed value. It sees value as open to new value forms, and he calls this a kind of democratic dynamism. So against this very nice conception that Teppo lays out in his chapter in the book, he identifies some key aspects of the welfare state ethos that connect with community economy concerns. First of all, he sees trust of the welfare as a very big part of the welfare state tradition, the idea of mutuality and social cohesion. He sees recognition of all citizen inputs and their value that is also part of this welfare state ethos. He sees the welfare state as often being involved in supporting a decommodified sphere of production that serves the sphere of production. And of course, in our view, we don't see this kind of as in a hierarchical relationship. We've abandoned that notion, but they definitely, there is a sense in which decommodified value is promoted. And of course, more recently, there's been this interest by the welfare state in the co-production of public services. So obviously in states across the world and within the nation state, there's an intensely variegated geography of how or whether these qualities exist or have been undermined or in many cases have never existed. And I'm very conscious of the fact that he is talking about the welfare state in the Nordics countries, and many of us are involved in living in countries where this kind of hold of the welfare state has been undermined or perhaps never existed in the first place. The state is, of course, a very contested terrain. However, Teppo sees there as being some opening for a value conception that deviates from a narrowly capitalist one. And in some of our countries, I think there is still a remnant belief the state has a role in maintaining commons and defending public goods that benefit their citizens, whether it's from roads to schoolings to hospitals, and also a belief in the distribution of services based on equality of access. This is what Teppo calls this welfare state ethos. So what he does is asks us to say, could there be a diffusion of community economy conceptions of value into the welfare state? And we might add today, could COVID provide an opportunity for this diffusion to take hold, or at least to get some purchase where none was granted before? This year I had a glimmer of such a diffusion when I was involved in discussions here in Australia with a group of people who are interested in advancing the idea of a universal basic income payment. So the UBI has been of long-standing policy interest on the left. It's a radical idea that has increasingly entered the mainstream. It involves a payment by the state to every citizen to meet their needs. And usually the purists see it as being made without any work or activity test associated with that payment. And some years ago, members of CERN engaged with James Ferguson's book, Give a Man a Fish, which argued the case for basic income grants to be made to the millions of citizens in Southern Africa, especially young people who will never find a paying job. So the basic income payment rests on a certain conception of value that stands outside a capitalist one. So when in Australia, during the early part of the pandemic, the Australian government stepped in to offer what they call job seeker payments at double the previous level of unemployment benefits, and these were to be offered to unemployed people who had been unemployed before and during and because of the pandemic. A group formed to push for the permanent introduction of what we called a livable income guarantee as a kind of stepping stone to a UBI, or perhaps a more palatable version. So this proposal was for a payment to be made to all Australian citizens, including those who have been excluded by JobSeeker. We proposed it would be an opt-in payment, conditional on recipients not having an adequate market income and undertaking a self-reported participation activity, as well as being over 16 years of age. It would be a payment that wouldn't compromise other benefit payments, so it wouldn't make people that were in certain conditions worse off, and it could be set at the amount of the aged pension in Australia. So what's interesting here is this idea of a participation activity, and the kind of legitimate social contributions to be eligible were listed as such. Now, you can see that these kind of activities are very much the activities that we normally associated with activities in the lower part of the diverse economy iceberg. So a policy brief has been prepared by a number of economists in the group, and it showed that the actual cost of this kind of exercise would be less than the revenue that would be lost to the state when the stage 3 of tax cuts that have been proposed by our Conservative government for 2024 and 25 would be introduced. So what they're demonstrating it is a very affordable intervention if there were political will. So to my mind, this proposal affirms the existence of a diverse economy. It affirms state and societal support for all the activities under the waterline that produce multiple kinds of value. The livable income guarantee could be seen as an investment in building community economies. It would allow many urbans to flower, very much a lot of urban gardening, food gardening to be done. And it maybe would even allow for flying fox communities to be properly cared for. It would certainly unleash commoning value. And perhaps it would even allow for community economies to take off. One of the inspirations for how the livable income guarantee might work was actually the Community Development Employment Program, which was initiated in the 1970s, and that was actually administered by Aboriginal controlled organisations and brought economic security to First Nations people living in remote settlements. Note, this initiative was very much administered through collective organisations, as opposed to being purely an individualist kind of intervention. So participants in the CDEP were paid at award wages for 15 hours of work per week, and the definition of work participation was very flexible so that it supported Indigenous notions of labour and contribution. This enabled a coming together of access to a livable income in a monetary sense, with the recognition of the value to community of ceremony, of caring for country, of artwork, of traditional food provision. Well, the Community Development Employment Program is no longer in operation today, and the Livable Income Guarantee has yet to be adopted. But I think in these policies, we can see the potential meshing of community economy values, aspects of a welfare state ethos, and in this case, Indigenous values. So I've done a lot there thinking about the kinds of work that is going on around measurement that could perhaps move towards thinking about policy. And I want to spend the last few minutes of my talk on a much more incipient conversation that I think is happening within our network. And I haven't got as much to say about it, but I think it's incredibly important. And this is thinking with others who have values-based, a non-capitalist ethos and who are practicing that in ways alongside community economies thinking. So community economies has a lot to learn, I think, from the long-standing and time-honoured values of community support, mutuality, reciprocity, care, ritual, and spiritual connection to earth that have been part of many Indigenous communities and diasporic Black communities and rural communities, especially in the Global South. And some of our work has been involved in trying to document a variety of practices, particularly around Asia, informed by these very different ethics. And it's important to continue to explore ways that our work might connect with, learn from, and offer support to struggles for self-determination and the preservation and development of other ways of surviving well. And in a very inspiring session we had on the Black social economy, organised by Caroline Shanaz Hussain, who is part of the audience, I hope, at Liviana a few days ago. We talked about the values and ethos of Ubuntu, the idea that I am because you are, or that a person is a person because of other people, and also Ujamaa, or cooperative economics. Both of these practices and these philosophies having deep roots in Africa and the African diaspora. Exploring the connectivities with community economies here is a conversation that I think is waiting to happen, and I'd like to see it flourish. But I'd like to end with some reflections that were prompted by Maria Barg's wonderful chapter in the Handbook of Diverse Economies on Indigenous finance. In this chapter, Maria introduces us to the core cultural values of Te Arawa Maori that guide decisions around financial practices and organisational narratives of Maori enterprise in Aotearoa, New Zealand. She outlines 5 cultural values, and they're not static, of course, but are always becoming. One is whanaungatanga, and I apologise for my pronunciation, which refers to all the relationships among and between people, with landscape features, with flora and fauna across generations. Another is manankatanga and kaitiakatanga, which is the understandings that come with these kind of genealogical connections and the nurturing and guardianship that these relationships call forth. Another is mana, or the authority that certain people and leaders and groups of people have over specific resources and areas. Another is tapu, a spiritual quality and connection to all things that guides and regulates behaviours. And another is utu, or balance, the key mechanism for ensuring the maintenance of relationships, which might involve action to restore balance when rules are breached. So unlike in Australia, where there was never a treaty with First Nations people, and the land was violently deemed to be terra nullius, or an empty land, in New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi forced colonisers to recognise Maori's claim to sovereignty and authority over property and other resources. So these core values have been able to guide management of their domain. As with Teppo's comparison of the welfare state ethos with community economy concerns, Maria explains how many of these core values have some similarities and many differences to those of community economies. Some of the similarities are the ideas of interdependence with human and earth others, and the ethical action involved in surviving well, encountering others, commoning. And also then the difficulties and issues around negotiation to achieve community. She notes, however, that the spiritual quality of connection is less present in our work and suggests that this could be explored for a richer understanding. And I know that Anissa and Isaac also brought up this kind of idea of spiritual connection and practice in their chapter in the handbook. I see that this element is central, I think, to our reconceptualizing the subject as both more than human and also perhaps more than in the present. And I think that perhaps the concept of shimmer that Deb writes about in her book might be one way that we can start to think about this spiritual quality. She talks about shimmer as being this interactive phenomena that draws people together, that experience the dynamics of participation in the enduring and the ephemeral, in birth, life and death, and mutualistic, multi-species waves of ancestral power. Acknowledging connectivity and interdependence is a call to ethical action. And I've tried to sketch out some of the very different pathways that community economy scholars and practitioners are traveling. And interestingly, I realized I kind of juxtaposed the kind of rational measurement kind of policy direction with the kind of spiritual, very unknown, uncertain, hard to pin down connection. But I think both of these things are going to be increasingly important to us as we travel along together. And I really look forward to seeing how these journeys, where they take us and how they bring together different kinds of connectivities in the future. So thank you. That's my talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kath. It was a great journey through so many of the rich work that people in the network are doing now. Thanks so much. That was wonderful. So thanks those of you that are putting on cameras. It's nice to have some faces when it comes to this moment. So if you've got a comment you want to make or a question you would like to ask, please just let us know in the chat and I will call on folks to turn on their microphones and ask their question if they feel like it. While you're contemplating the wording of a question, I've got a question, Kath. It's something that's been occurring to me lately as I've talked about. I'm working with some wonderful Indigenous colleagues at the University of Canberra, and we were having a conversation yesterday about these various terms of cultural competency and cultural integrity and the various meanings that come along with that. And one thing that occurred to me is that you have when they talk about cultural ways of knowing and being, it made me think that kind of makes invisible the fact that the normative majority dominant ways of knowing and being are also cultural. And I was wondering what, if you have some thoughts on that, what that label does sometimes is to, when you talk about all these other ways, all these other forms of economic practice that are more collaborative and more ready to recognize the interdependence of the human with the more than human. What language do you think we can use to talk about it that doesn't designate that somehow as cultural and a majority kind of more capitalocentric view as somehow not cultural?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I guess culture, you know, everything is cultural, and some of the work, I guess, that's been done on genealogy of economic concepts tries to pin down its cultural origins, you know, and be more specific about particular practices that have come out of particular contexts. And clearly, you know, so many of them have come from a kind of Western industrialized context and then become extrapolated into a universalism and so on. So you're battling always that binarism, that these things are seen as culture and these things are seen as economy. And I guess that's why, you know, we've been very interested in trying to go back to practices rather than these abstractions. And of course, we can see then that so many of these so-called other practices that are, you know, attributed to maybe rural communities are actually still alive in very urbanized Western contexts as well. So there's not the sense that these things are only over there in these environments and not here. So I think there's work to be done to kind of do that deconstruction work in order to, in order to break down, it's a kind of breaking down that universalism and specifying and being specific and allowing for urban Western industrial context to also have attachment to other kinds of ethics. Even, I think there was a question in the session we had on the Black social economy around capitalist enterprises that people are involved in, and to what extent there is collectivity within capitalist enterprise. And that, again, is one of those breaking down of not seeing capitalist enterprises only ever a kind of dominated by a particular individualist profit-seeking motive, and seeing a multiple ethics actually being practiced potentially even within that kind of image that's been so kind of universalized and presented as the dominant business model. And this is some of the work that Stephen and Jenny and Joe and I have done recently, trying to kind of delve into the kind of business cultures that actually can affirm other relationships, perhaps with, you know, providing good jobs, providing environmental sustainability and so on. So to kind of prise open that way in which that language of capitalist business has been commandeered by a particular conception of business that doesn't have to be the only way to do business, where you have people who might be wage laborers who but are actually getting decent jobs and who might not want to do the work of being a cooperative, for instance, you know. So I think there's work to be done to do that fine-grained kind of pulling apart in all these contexts. It's great to see your comments and wonderful. Thanks, Rebecca. I love seeing knitting in the frame is important.
Go and see.
I think Viv will like that idea too.
And in our meetings in the Community Economies Institute, Kath's on the board. There's a few of us that are members of the board, and Kath's often there with her knitting.
I don't think I'll get it out now though.
No, that's all right. Would anyone else like to pipe up with a question?
Isaac seems to have something to say.
You seem to have something you've partly articulated there. Would you like to put on your microphone?
My keyboard was playing up, but yeah, I was just seeing a connection here between the presentation and Pete North's discussion on Building Back Better, when Pete was critiquing the furlough or the JobKeeper and saying that what they're trying to do is pause the economy and have a V-shaped recovery and hope that we'll just bounce back again and people will get their jobs back and it will be as it was. And when we're talking about the universal basic income and, you know, ways of going about economy in ways that are not ethnocentric, because the whole furlough scheme to me just seemed to be a very ethnocentric, capitalocentric enterprise, and assuming that we will just reinvigorate the economy that we had before, with albeit the gas-fired recovery going alongside it, which will be an extractive, ethnocentric enterprise par excellence. So I'm just thinking, Katherine, with this deconstruction work, how we advocate for the UBI as alternatives to those kind of you know, business as usual approaches, and connecting it with what Pete was saying about building back better.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the debates that went on in the group were very kind of hung up on this idea of, should we be valuing this kind of value by paying it, or should we be giving more money? I mean, so it was still kind of kept within this vision of the UBI as within a kind of a capitalocentric economy, rather than seeing it as an investment in something that could take off in a different direction and potentially contribute to a more degrowth vision of the world. I mean, if more people could be doing what Lucy was talking about, or Katherine was saying she'd like to start doing in her own land, you know, what impact would that have in cities in terms of creating the possibility of a one planet footprint, ecological footprint? And what would be the value of that to the world, you know? So there's this way in which the UBI is seen as still a kind of a welfare payment just to keep you shored up within a capitalist economy, rather than an investment in something that could take off in a different direction, but be a very different kind of economy. And I think when I talked to some of those people about this and sent them that paper, they kind of went, oh yeah, but it wasn't kind of part of their conception. And I think this is where I think our work could, you know, we need to kind of be putting it out there more in that policy kind of world. So yeah, but interested to hear how that could happen in the UK context. I'm not sure.
I noticed there are a couple of chats. Sarah, if you wanted to follow up on your comment to Kath, wave and let me know. Okay, go ahead.
I can.
I know there's one from Pete, and then there's also one from Gay here. Yeah. So
Yep.
Pete?
Nice to see you all again.
Oh, Sarah. Yes.
So I was commenting because you were talking about the kind of fine-grained type of work. What I'm trying to do with my dissertation is I'm exploring collaborative practices that are centered on food and are carried out by Hispanic communities in the United States. And what I'm encountering is that a lot of the values, the cultural values that people bring from their country of origins are embedded in the type of practices that they develop. And this morning, for example, I was doing an interview with this woman who has a catering company, but also she's a health coach. And so she developed in the United States a business, which is set up as more as a business as usual. But she was telling me that the type of things she teaches to other people, how to, especially women, how to take care of themselves, how to eat well, and how to develop practices that are more sustainable, how to use more sustainable packaging and food, and reduce the ecological footprint. And I found that as all of a system of values that we don't find in very capitalist oriented type of business as usual, even though if we look at that type of business is somehow set up as a business as usual. And so there are so many things that I'm encountering that are very, very interesting. I'm still in the middle of all of it, but I will go through it.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Lovely to see you too. Great to hear about the work.
So I might actually go, Gay and Ozan have asked related questions in the chat. So I might go to that first and then come back to you, Pete, afterwards, and then look at what else is coming up. So Gay had a question about the shift from counting to valuing. And Ozan had a follow-up question, which is about the source of value in a diverse economy.
Can I just
about time and labor. Yeah, Gay, do you want to speak to that question? Go ahead.
Oh, it's a bit incoherent.
That's 8 o'clock.
Yeah, I'm not at my peak performance. But it is a great sort of idea that or problem that you threw in, Kath, about how community economies has shifted from beyond inventories of what matters, what are all the important inputs into economic practices, to how they're valued. So that just seems to me, that what happens, doesn't that just highlight the fundamental interconnection between quantifying and qualifying? That when you say what matters and how are these things going to be valued, that's an inherently political move, deciding what qualities are going to be valued, which ones are going to matter the most. That to me is inherently political, not just ethical, and it's about what STS would call qualification, and quantification is qualculation or something. Yeah, that crazy word. Yeah. So how does that figure in all this? It seems to me that valuing is really important as a political act.
Yeah, I think it is, and the problem, or not the problem, I guess I feel like this, jumping into this is a political act, obviously, to do this kind of measurement and then to attribute monetary value to it by I mean, in a way we kind of mix, and Teppo talks about two different notions of value, the kind of old Marxian value, which sees that labor time in production is important, and then the more, mainstream vision that just sees whatever is paid in the market as subjective value, because the market kind of determines what the price is at any time. And we see then value also being created in all these other activities that are not production in the classical Marxist sense, and are non-marketized in the classic mainstream sense. But in order to speak to policymakers, I think you have to step in. That's why I say using the master's tools, you step into their terrain to use the valuations that they might accept. So for instance, if someone is learning how to take notes in a meeting in Durban and what to administer a small kind of business of urban agriculture within the context of that urban in that project, we kind of estimated those hours as the kind of the cost of getting that education at a community college, or the cost of hiring an administrator to do that work. So we kind of used all the variety of things we see as valuable and kind of smushed them into a monetary frame in order to come up with that 3.4 million euro return on a return. And it's not as though, you know, it's not a kind of abstract ideal way of valuing. It's a way of valuing still within someone else's frame, but in order to make an argument about this idea of return on investment, you know. And if we see, you know, money is kind of itself neutral. I mean, some people wouldn't agree with that in the more kind of left alternative economy view. They want to get rid of all money. But to some extent, it is a mechanism, and we could use that money mechanism as a way of kind of forging this argument around, you know, how are we going to get to a one planet economy? Well, we're all going to have to disengage in certain ways, but there's all these other ways of engagement, and they are actually creating values that could be measured. So it's yeah, it is and I think qualitative calculation is really important, and I think it's, you know, it's some way that I think we have of having more purchase within a policy framework, because those kinds of estimations have some sort of more purchase. And it seemed to me just recently with this scare we've all had that the NSF isn't going to fund research coming out of a post-structuralist or relativist point of view, or the UK talking about not allowing post-capitalist work to be taught in schools. I mean, there's this discussion coming up. I think there's a way in which we could present our work in frameworks or in kind of formats that might be quite palatable, but still be making our arguments for a kind of how do we invest in a different kind of economy? What are the mechanisms for doing that? Oof.
Thanks. I wanted to just invite Ozan if you wanted to follow up.
Thank you very much, Katherine. As always, very inspiring. I'm just really wondering what might be the language for analyzing value in a diverse economy. Of course, I mean, we all know about labor from a Marxian point of view, or using time as an alternative. Whether you have a recent view in regard to Teppo's discussion, if we are looking at practices, and if we are looking at non-market, non-capitalist practices, what is the language that we can use in regard to value here? That is my kind of research question. I'm struggling, and I wonder whether there might be some inspiration here. Thank you.
Well, I guess, I mean, I'm kind of using value and values and kind of interchangeably to some extent. And I think our ethical concerns are a form of a set of values. And that's what was interesting to me about Teppo's work, is that he kind of extrapolated from our thinking a community economy value conception that he talked about. So I think, you know, I don't think there is a language. I think it's sort of slippery here, but there are core concerns, core commitments that we see as hopefully, you know, producing some kind of conception of, you know, ethical encounter and surviving well, etc., that we laid out as core concerns that are then our values, and how they get translated and measured is the kind of empirical question that I'm kind of battling with here. So I don't feel like there is a definitive answer. I think we're all kind of coming at this in different ways, and I think the people I've mentioned in terms of their research are all doing that, and I can see lots of other things in the text boxes there that are referring to other groups that are trying to do this. But it definitely intersects with all this kind of work about measurement of happiness and all these kinds of other you know, expanding the conception of what we think of as part of what an economy is. So there's a body of work here, and I think we can draw on all of these things strategically, and that's really what I'm trying to do, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Kath.
How do you manage all these comments?
Well, I'm starting an authoritarian rule. So the issue of language is a really great one, I think, for the CERN network actually to think through together, because we crossed many different languages, and the question of translation is something that comes up from time to time. The way, well, even the name of this conference, you know, we're thinking of a light version of the conference we'd planned, but then there's, you know, in English it becomes problematic because there's light and dark and good and bad, which is why Anna suggested the Spanish, which has very different set of associated understandings, which are much more joyful. And yeah, anyway, I'm just taking chair's privilege to interject. I had promised to go to Pete to follow up quickly. Pete North, did you want to add on to this conversation about value? And you were talking about questions of social democracy and examples in the UK. Your microphone is not on, sorry.
There's always one, isn't there? So I thought it was fascinating that Kath talked about the Australian experience of the community. I can't remember what you called them, the community projects that are emerging to deal with COVID that were similar to what was happening in the 70s and the 80s. Because, I mean, as Kath knows, we had a lot of that in the UK in the 1970s and the 1980s. And it is the case, as Isaac said, that at the moment, the UK government with the furlough scheme is trying to just keep the old going, so we bounce through the bad bit. But we just found out today that our furlough is going on now till March. And I think that might give us a chance to, now when the old can't work anymore, social movement theorists talk about mobilizing events when people think that doing something different is timely and becomes feasible, where it wasn't timely and feasible before. So, I mean, in the UK, actually, that Thatcherite Conservative government was talking about a lot of those kind of projects and thinking about ways that we might do economics differently. And in Britain, the Tory government would be open to thinking about entrepreneurialism in different ways, thinking about business in different ways, you know, rather than trying to go back to social democracy, which for us is probably a pretty closed discussion in Brexit Britain. And that linked up quite nicely to me when I heard about the New Zealand experience. I was in New Zealand in 2003, 2004, when there was the New Zealand coalition government of New Zealand First and National, and they talked about their social responsibility agenda, and they talked about diverse economies, and they talked about self-help, and I looked at green dollars over there. But you could see what their conception of diverse economies was being independent of the state, and they didn't really worry too much about how well people were. In Britain, we're a little bit like that at the moment. So it might be that this gives us a chance to break into something ever so different and ever so interesting, because, you know, COVID is acting on us. You know, our government thought we'd be out of it by now, and it's obviously not the case. So I think there's a real opportunity to have a discussion that in Finland might be about the language of social democracy, but in Britain, it might be that we need to think more about, you know, languages of entrepreneurialism and self-help and dynamism in a slightly more Schumpeterian way, which we could be scared of, or could create some opportunities if we're thinking in a non-paranoid way. I'm probably ridiculously optimistic there. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, Caroline's got a question too, but I'll make just a quick answer. It's funny, I was thinking of adding into the talk, but I decided not to, partly because of this language issue, this idea that I remember Julie saying once upon a time, oh, you know, gifting and volunteering is the primitive accumulation for community economies. And that term primitive accumulation is you know, obviously comes from Marx's view that capitalism was based on the, you know, basically dispossession of capital, land, and everything else that became the kind of, you know, the gift in a way that it used to then generate industrial takeoff. But of course, and you know, that term primitive is really a very freighted term, which I don't want to use anymore. But the idea that there is, as Michelle Bowens talks about, this kind of commandeering value from one system and putting it into another, I like, because I think that is going to be useful to us, that we could, rather than be hung up on, is this enterprise going to be co-opted to the state or not if it gets set up? If we had a language of seeing how these different kind of bits and pieces could be kind of cohered into a different value system that could produce takeoff, using Rostow's terms, for a different kind of community economy, I think, you know, we can take that language and move it around and see these grants that might come out of the EU, you know, generated on colonialist wealth at whatever, going into something that then is going to produce a very different kind of dispersion and creation of different kinds of values. So it just seems to me something we could be working with a bit more.
I'm just going to step in. So I'm looking at the time, and Kath needs to go at 15:15. So I'm going to ask Caroline, obviously you've got something to add into this part of the conversation. And I think Kelly's comment in the chat as well indicates that she's got some great additions to put in here. So can I ask, you don't want to talk to your point, Kelly. Okay, well, Caroline, go ahead. And then
you can go, Kelly, if yours is more related. Mine's different.
No. Jump in, Caroline.
Okay,
cool, go ahead.
So I wanted to say thank you for your talk. I feel so much more settled by this talk, and I'm really happy the ways in which we, you know, give space to indigeneity, into other voices, to be able to make knowledge and to theorize. So that's why I think in so many ways, community economies, the literature, works for some of the stuff I'm doing. And I was really happy to hear you sort of speak a little bit to Ubuntu and Ujamaa, these really ancient African concepts of collectivity and cooperation and what have you. But I'm wondering, I'm always trying to figure out, maybe there's a paper we need to write sort of like about, you know, racial capitalism and community economies, but with a really strong feminist, I don't know, I guess underlining of theorizing to it, because I've seen people critique CERN or community economies, but they just miss that really strong sort of feminist view on these other kinds of productions that are often not valued. And in some societies and in some cultures, it's the informal that matters, because that's where people seek refuge. So sort of speaking to what Peter was saying about, you know, sometimes the state isn't an option, neither is mainstream economics, right? And then people perform in all these various non-capitalist type of enterprises, and some are individualized. And my battle has been, you know, do I force more cooperativism? But that has often been not a space of safety for some groups. So they turn to individualized forms of setting up enterprises. But I'd like to hear if you could speak to me more about sort of this idea of, because, you know, there is this Marxist tendency that, you know, looks around community economies. And I think for people of color, and particularly those of African descent, there's been a troubled relationship with sort of old school Marxism, because it's been alienating of race, to be quite frank. And, you know, Du Bois wasn't shy on that. So I'd like to hear a little bit on how do we connect community economies theory, and maybe the informal aspects of it, and that to people of color, because I mean, I see relevance to it in so many places of the global South, but also to communities that are under siege right now in Western parts of the world.
Oh, I think I think you said it right from the beginning. I don't know that we're ready to write a paper about it, but I think we're ready to have more discussions about this, to develop these connections more, because I think there are a group of people in CERN who are interested in and are working on some of these questions a bit more than I am right at the moment, certainly in terms of the understanding and theorization of racialized capitalism coming out of the movements in the US at the moment, and others perhaps could talk about that. But and I think this is one of those places of conversation that I'd like to see us kind of move in and do more reading on. And for instance, that all the work that's been done around that the cooperative economy, the Ujamaa, is fascinating. And I feel like this is something that is kind of worth more, I guess, more reading and thought about at the moment, guided by, what's out there and finding it and adding it to our readings, because this is something that, I think has been an absence, definitely. I think there's other, there's work that's gone on engaged with theorists in Asia and other places, but perhaps not as much in some of the regions and work that you're more familiar with, Caroline. So I don't have an answer to your question so much. And I think I feel like it's, as I said, a conversation starting that I'd love to see happen more. And perhaps we could organize a kind of a workshop or some kind of a reading group or something that comes out of this over the next year that would really kind of start to advance that agenda a little bit more. So thanks so much for that input.
Thank you, everyone. I might call it to an end there, although there's lots of rich comments that have, and thoughts and reflections that have been coming up in the chat that are, this is, luckily we're all in a network together, and there's always opportunities for ongoing conversation. And also just on that final point, I'm not sure if everyone here knows there is currently a working party group within the Community Economies Institute that have are taking up this issue around justice and equity, and thinking about how we address it as a collective, and starting to discuss opportunities for shared work that might further thinking in this direction. So there's a few people in this meeting that are in that group, Anna Heras, Leo Huang, and others as well. So yes, it's something that we recognize as really important as a group too, and we hope to keep this conversation going. But look, it's nearly 9:20 here, and thank you so much for all of your contributions and thought and engagement, and thank you so much to Katherine Gibson for your wonderful talk today. It was a really great event. Thank you. For those